I saw all these cars on.
I was gonna,
The share.
you came and you couldn't find car cam, you moved my car.
Thanks. No,
Yeah.
I knew the back,
You knew that we,
the back lot.
yeah, yeah.
Oh, there's the
The
share.
director.
When it comes in.
Oh, yeah, yeah, that's Roger ended up. Yeah. And you?
I lived in Lansing.
Oh, my.
So I knew that area.
Would you go to college?
Where can I find
I think
the?
I've seen that on a resume
Zoom
here. but
meeting.
I've already seen it.
Is it posted on your town website?
Not that
Yeah.
Yes,
And so.
I can't seem to find it on here.
Oh, Art, it's in the top right corner, it says.
Oh, Zoom meeting.
Unlocked. Yeah.
Some of it's absolutely identified.
Call them up and say, come in.
Well, I'm trying, but I think that when you're planning for storms, that should be where education
I was
is.
driving a trailer and I had a bunch of trash in the back of the trailer and a bunch of papers.
Flew out. I
Brilliant
wonder if
state
that was you
troopers
I was
picked up.
following. I had my phone trying to
Okay, so
videotape. I
then
couldn't
you-
get the
you-
license
this was
plate
years
of the
ago.
guy.
And the state trooper just called me up and
Great.
said, you have a lot of your papers through the hall.
I was his restaurant.
Where were you? What has
I was
happened?
between Blue Hill and Surrey going to the dump. I was
Yeah.
getting rid of a lot of stuff. but
Yeah,
we
you
were
got to
flying.
go on the road, 72.
So there I was going back across,
Yeah.
walking along, picking up my trash.
And that's how you met Mark? No.
Yeah, absolutely.
She was going the other way.
Yeah, so
No, I
that
was
would work.
saying there that, what's
Great,
missing.
so I'll just share my screen and then it'll.
So like when
Oh, there.
we're doing education. It's not part of the conversation, because every storm creates all this trash, some of it's toxic. And so it's gotta be part of the education is, number one, battening down the hatches.
Yeah.
Before a storm,
Yes.
so this doesn't happen, and two, knowing we don't have to clean that stuff up after.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know whose jurisdiction it is, and
So-
trash from Surrey and Newbury, that blows up all the people.
I left something in my car.
Oh, yeah.
Will I be locked
I'll
in?
just hold it.
Okay, thank you.
We'll let you back.
Yeah.
Don't worry.
Some huge turnout, you had in the presentation tonight.
Standing room only. I think there were maybe, including the selectmen, 12 people. President.
In your conference room there, the one we have our select with.
Yeah.
That's
It's amazing how little.
It happens so fast, you know?
The correlation
In the summer,
between
summer,
meetings
summer,
like this.
winter,
We have the expert here, to ask questions to it, it's amazing how. The people already know, we've already read the reports and so we don't know what to ask. Good job.
Big turnout, I'm sure, you had a big turnout for the special town meeting where the vote was to agree to discuss the dam. Yes. I heard from Bill Robert. That turnout was, where you did.
Nice to see you. Hi, Sherwood.
And it's amazing because we have
Yeah.
34 taxpayers.
Did you have your meeting?
Yes.
No, no.
I will say that some of the people that came to our meeting were from Philadelphia.
Oh, yeah. Bill Roberts.
Can everybody come to the meeting tomorrow night?
I know, is it?
Yes.
Well, it's just because I'm a
We're
president of Hall.
How you doing? Welcome.
I like
I'm going to see you.
The special.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know.
Of course, that's what you got. For the public.
Yeah.
Good enough, Mary, right?
Good exercise, I think.
The hearing.
Oh, yes, oh, yes.
We got an inspector today.
Yeah.
He didn't tell me that, no, I talked to him on the phone, we had a nice long conversation, and I said that we weren't ready. We just told him that you were actually a company. Look at that, we don't have anything to say, so when did you do that?
We spent about 4 hours.
Oh, my goodness.
Are you one of the selectmen? I am not. 100 is a bit
Limited
much, but
access.
Yeah.
with the 100 one,
Twenty funds,
it's gone
you
up.
could see pretty good.
So
Really? Okay. Good, good.
It's
A lot
fascinating.
of work.
How did you get them out of that?
I don't think
Well, personally, I think people should.
they've
rip
done
that
anything
out of their house.
since
I would be very surprised if they had put it since they bought
Yeah,
the place.
yeah.
And I was surprised.
It's gonna depress
We
them
spent quite a bit of time in Silver Lake. Terry was working when they rebuilt it. Rebuilt it the next time. And I read a report that they said there was severe leakage. And we couldn't find anything, and somebody's been maintaining
But, yeah, so how do you do
the
it?
earthen part of the dam. They've been cutting,
Yes, it will work in the shower.
kept it mowed.
Oh,
You allow trees or something to grow, you get the intrusion. And
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So somebody's been taking care of it. I don't know who.
Okay, well, good to know. I'll pass that along. Thank you very much for taking.
Is that the one where that's not the one
I'll
where they
thank
built
Terry
it, they were
too.
coming down. No,
Because
that's,
that's-
when they were playing.
Even though we can't go send divers down, so we go property or the dam, doing that, walking around that, that's very, very helpful.
I mean, you can pretty much tell. What divers, you know, the body pond, it's pretty simple.
Yeah, yeah.
It's only about 600 feet of head, so
Okay.
And some candles.
that nuisance,
Replace the can.
really.
It's like you watch through and you think like candlelight is gonna do it for you. I would just think like this. Tiger mask.
You can tell them, right up to the
Yeah.
normal dam like that. Cables with floats on them,
Yeah.
so you can't go up it.
Right.
You're gonna be able to be away
Walk up
from
the
that.
bank.
Yeah.
For years, I said, God, I had more water than
Well, it's been so dry, it was,
It's pretty low.
Now I can.
yeah, and
3 miles down
I
the
did.
road.
most of the water was coming through the fish.
Because my house is gonna.
Yeah,
wash
yeah.
away, so I wanted to see if they had a picture of my house. Yeah, so here's my house here.
When they say
No,
no,
I am not.
there's a
I'm trying to.
But the one with just the-
past the carrying place,
Yeah.
140 is it home or?
I can't-
Like, oh, it's always like one person gets to go. I never understood how to say it.
Yeah, it's surprising. I don't know if that's from.
Yes.
There you get a different perspective in the water, but then there's a lot of towns that don't have.
Oh, she doesn't want to be there. I've never seen her so stressed out in my life.
Oh, and one does-
She's like, "Okay, what's wrong?"
Next page.
Yeah, the administrative. Oh, that's the one specific.
You get such a big turnout. Publicized. Right.
Don sent me the application. Is there a way to use this information to look at this meeting? The issue with the need or whatever. That's right. Right, I was just thinking.
But then true recently.
Well, it's the old story, but
I have 1 foot on a block of ice and 1 foot in boiling water, on average, I'm comfortable, right? So, they're,
And I find.
we may be able to do that.
You know, now I have.
Either with median. But I don't know how we get this through. Unless we can take
Have you lived in Surrey?
Alone?
Yeah.
Well, since it's not 2000, it's not documented. Yeah, you're saying that's because it's, all my work and it's really nice to miss the traffic. I can just commute to Boston. I only worked in Boston. I commuted from this, like, you know, Boston area.
Yeah.
I commuted from Plymouth to Boston every day.
That's nice.
Yeah, it's a long way, it's about 50 miles.
Mhm. That's far.
Nothing we can learn from. Yeah.
Well, that's a big.
What brought you to Surrey?
Well, I had a place here since 2003 and. Decided to move there full time. We enjoyed it. It was just a place to get away to. Life became a lot simpler once we did that. Yeah, sorry, I didn't get back there. I just want to make sure you knew about it. Oh, yeah, were you away? Were you away?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Had a good trip, I take it.
We were in and out.
That way we can resolve the whole thing.
Helped a lot more since the.
Yeah.
Why I didn't wear the shirt that Tom has, I didn't expect we were called to match. And the same shirt, just a little lighter.
Well, we'll plan it better next time.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Really, I like this job. Yep. Amazing. I remember this. It's not chairs.
And people on.
Yeah. Yes. Hi, everybody. I'm Mary Allen. I'm on the select board here in Surrey. Thank you so much for coming. This is an important day for us in Surrey because we've got a report on the climate vulnerability study that started before I became officially involved with the town of Surrey as a select person. So I didn't do any work writing the grant proposals that got us the funding. So I'm not going to take that kind of credit at all. But I'm going to turn over the introduction portion to get started to Alan Kratz, who's been instrumental in helping us obtain the funding, mainly through the Community Resilience Partnership of the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future. We've also been collaborating with the Gulf of Maine Research Institute as well as GEI engineering consultants. So I'm excited to hear the results and I'll turn over the next introduction to Alan. And thank you again, everyone online too, for coming tonight.
Do we go from Mary Allen to Alan Kratz? I like to. That's really nice.
We're not related.
So thank you very much for coming out tonight. I'm Alan Kratz and I'm the project manager for project that began 2 years ago. I want to start with a thank you, even though Mary wasn't on the board, Chris was, Tom was involved in, and many of you here helped get funding from the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future for the Community Resilience Partnership Project that basically is helping you look at public assets that are vulnerable to climate change. The same time that you were looking for funding and successfully got the funding for this project, your counterparts in Blue Hill and in Brooksville were doing the same. And it was actually in December 4th, Chris, I remember we were in Blue Hill and you said, why not have the Blue Hill and Brooksville grant funds combined with the Surry grant funds and go all together for a 3-town vulnerability assessment, knowing that climate change does not respect jurisdictional boundaries, but blows where it will. So Chris, thank you for suggesting that. The governor's office thought about it for 2 minutes and said, well, yes, that makes sense. So here we are, 2 years later. The process that ensued from the funding was that an oversight committee, Chris was on it, Irene is on it, were involved in procuring through a competitive process, the consulting firm to do the work. Turned out that it was GEI. We're delighted with GEI. I think we even had the interviewing here in this room. So really, you're back here and you're back here tonight to give us the results of this 2-year study. This is the second stop on a 3-town roadshow. At 5:30, we were in Blue Hill. And tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, 10:30, we'll be in Brooksville for a similar presentation. So here you are. And thank you for coming tonight.
Great, thank you, everybody. I'm gonna share my screen. I have a presentation. Let's see how this goes.
And I'm stepping out to get my phone from my phone so I can take a photo. So if somebody would let me back in, that would be very nice.
Yeah, I can do that.
There we go.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Leela Pike. I am a civil engineer with GEI Consultants in Portland. And I'm here to present the final presentation of this 2-year, 1.5 long project. Some of this information you may have seen before if you've looked at the material or attended any of the past public events, but some of it may be new. And Alan and Jeff will be hearing this for the second time tonight, so I'm aware if I make the same jokes. Okay, so there were 4 main goals. I'm gonna walk through each of those goals. And I distilled them into 4 main goals, but I'm gonna walk through each of those goals and the work products for those because there are quite a few. So just to help align everybody with what is out there. The first goal was to understand climate threats in Blue Hill, Brooksville, and Surry. And these are climate threats outside of flooding. That was its own goal. So these were threats like extreme heat, drought, ocean acidification, and I'll go through some of those. The work product for this is a joint climate vulnerability report. So each of the threats had its own memo that summarized the risk to the area. And those were compiled into one main mega report. So it's all together, and that same product is for each of the towns. So it wasn't specific to each town, but rather the region. The second goal of this project has been to evaluate the coastal flood risk and adaptation. So this would be flooding due to sea level rise and storm surge. The work product for this is a report specific to each town. So there is a Surry coastal flood risk and adaptation report where we dive more into detail of the risk of flooding within the town of Surry. The third goal was to introduce a pilot project. So this was to take one of the areas that was at risk of flooding and developed concept level adaptation plans for adapting to flood risk. That has its own report, pilot project report. So we're quite a few work products down. And then the final goal, as I've summarized it tonight, is community engagement. There has been some ongoing community engagement, but I just want to talk about what we're leaving you with. So there are 2 things that we're ending this project with, and these will continue on. And that is community science, which GMRI really brought to this project. And we'll talk about all of this during the presentation, and the story map. So that's an interactive website that is now live, and I'll have a QR code and we'll distribute a link at some point so that you can go and explore that yourself. So now I'm going to just go through each of these goals. So the first, to understand climate threats. The 7 threats, vulnerabilities that we looked at were heat, drought and drinking water, power outages, ocean acidification, plant hardiness, tick-borne diseases, and the working waterfront. I'm not going to dive into the findings and results of all of these, but I did pull out a few key findings for these that I'll walk through. So the first, oh, and I wanted to say, should have said before, please stop me and interrupt me and ask me questions as I go. I'd rather this be more interactive because I know it can kind of become kind of drony on my end. So anyways, the first one, drought and drinking water. So the drinking water in the town of Surry comes from wells, well water. And this isn't necessarily a climate threat, but something important to point out. There are pretty high rates of arsenic contamination in drinking water wells. You are not required to have your well tested, but of the tested wells in Surry, over 45% of them had high rates of arsenic contamination. So that's just something to be aware of. And one of the recommendations we have is to encourage homeowners to have their well water tested. A climate threat to well water is saltwater intrusion. So as the seas rise, that saltwater lens in the groundwater also rises, and any drilled well, as the saltwater rises, you can start pulling in that saltwater into your drinking water. Recommendation we have around this is to think about, there could potentially be zoning around new wells, where new wells could be drilled. You could take the results of a flood risk map to kind of inform which wells might be subject or more at risk of saltwater intrusion. So the second one I want to highlight is heat. There have been more extreme heat days. It's getting warmer. There are warmer nights. This has led to more prolonged heat. So, and as I mentioned in Blue Hill, the meeting we just had, we, as a state, the state of Maine, we're still a relatively cool state compared to the rest of the country. However, we are particularly vulnerable as Mainers because we're typically older. Our homes are older and less likely to have air conditioning in them. And we're just not acclimated to the heat. And that does make us as a population particularly vulnerable. So a recommendation we have around this is to establish a public cooling center. So a place that does have air conditioning that people can go to get relief from a stretch of high heat days. And also to incentivize heat pumps in homes. The heat pumps can both cool your home down and heat your home in the winter. So the last point that I'm going to make on this goal is ocean acidification. So this is when the pH level of the ocean decreases and that it becomes more acidic. This is due to carbon sequestration, I guess, into the ocean. And one thing about the Gulf of Maine is it already has a pretty low pH and cold temperatures. And so that makes it more vulnerable because there's less wiggle room for the pH to get lower without really threatening a lot of the species we have. Ocean acidification can also occur locally, so local wastewater or stormwater contributing to nutrient loading in the bay where you are. So one of the recommendations we have is to reduce the local nutrient loading via stormwater wastewater management practices. And then another resilience measure would be to diversify the fisheries. There are some clams and oysters, for example, are pretty sensitive to the pH of water. Lobsters, however, are not that sensitive. So something to consider. Yes.
Could you look at the impact of sea level rise and saltwater intrusion on the performance of septic systems?
We did not look at septic systems in this study. We do have information on the number of parcels that are inundated and also the number of buildings that are inundated. So you could make an assumption that for inundated, the number of inundated buildings could equate to the number of inundated septic systems, because I am assuming that all the buildings in Surrey are on private septic. And there is a risk, when septic system areas are inundated with water, then their performance decreases and it does contribute to that local nutrient loading. So the second goal was to evaluate coastal flood risk and adaptation. The main question here was which areas and assets are at risk of coastal flooding due to storm surge and sea level rise now and in the future. As we went through this project, we're working with all three towns, and for efficiency of the project, we're doing all the analysis at once. But then when we sat with the results, it really became clear to us that the town of Surrey knew the areas that were at risk of flooding. There are not that many that are at risk of flooding here, but they are important, each of them. So because there were fewer places at risk of flooding here, we went a little bit deeper in our analysis for the town of Surrey and actually did some more wave analysis to look at wave heights, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But for the broad brushstroke study for the three towns, we did an evaluation of flood risk by looking at 9 different flood scenarios. And these flood scenarios represent a range of timeframes. So present day, 2050, 2070, 2090, and either high tide in those timeframes or a 100-year coastal storm in that time frame. And that helps us understand areas that would be subject to flooding every single day versus just during a storm. And that helps us think about different adaptation measures. And each of these flood scenarios is represented by a water elevation. And this is just a static water elevation. If you look at the report, we also call that a still water level. And that's really just water that isn't moving, no waves on top of it. And so that's why we did add some waves for Surrey, because there weren't that many sites. So from this broad study, and this is Carrying Place Beach, this is an example of an inundation boundary, but we created inundation boundaries for these 9 scenarios. You'll be able to explore those in the story map. And from those inundation boundaries, we could summarize the lengths of roads that would be flooded under each scenario, or the number of buildings that would be impacted. And that could help us prioritize which areas would be important for adapting sooner. So here's just an example of the data that a summary of the results. So the first table on top is roads, and it's okay if you can't read those words, I'll explain them to you. But this is for each of the 9 scenarios, the colors on top, what length of road would be flooded under those different scenarios. So the high priority road that we have is Newberry Neck Road. That experiences flooding today. And then medium priority, we put Carrying Place Lane and Crossroad. So some of the reasons that these are, how we prioritize these were based on how exposed to flooding they are, but it could also be based on the impact it would have if that road was flooded. So if people were cut off, or if it was just the end of a dead end road, we might have lowered it in priority. And then the second table down is additional assets. So the town wharf parking area, for example, that experiences flooding today. The Newberry Neck Beach, Carrying Place Beach at Newberry Neck Road parking area also experiences flooding today. And then the last table is the number of buildings. And there's more information on this in the report, but for a number of buildings impacted there in the town of Surrey, 5 buildings would likely be flooded for 100-year storm scenarios for today's time frame, present day sea levels. And then the worst case we looked at is 5 feet of sea level rise in a 100-year storm, and in that situation, there would be 20 buildings that would be impacted. So 3 of those sites, we did additional wave analysis for, and that was Newbury Neck Road, Carrying Place Beach, Cross Road, and the town wharf. And this is just a diagram to show the difference in the broad brush study versus that more detailed analysis. So the broad brush study gives us a still water level. So that is just, if you take high tide and then a storm comes, or storm surge on top of high tide, and now that's still just standing water. And then as the winds push towards shore, we get something called wave setup. And that's really like, as that water is moving towards shore, it's pushing up. On top of wave setup, we also have waves. And then as everything, the waves and wave setup and still water elevation comes towards shore, it runs up on whatever it's meeting and causes run up. And the height of that wave run up is often what will be the flood level. So if you look at FEMA flood maps, for example, it's often that wave run up value. And that you really need to calculate specific to a shoreline, because it very much depends on if there's a steep structure there, or if it's a shallow beach. And so, when we did this 3-town study, it's not feasible to do that everywhere, but for these 3 sites, it is feasible. And so that's what we got to here. So here's an example of how this would work. So for Cross Road, this picture on the left shows a bunch of angles of fetch length. So that's like the distance of open water that the wind can move over before it gets to the shore. And that's what can build up that wave action. So we are able to look at all of these different fetch lengths. We did some statistics of wind data in order to calculate what a 100-year wind speed would be. And using that information could calculate the wave heights that would be near this location. So for Cross Road, we're looking at near shore wave heights of about 4.6 feet during a 100-year storm. The wave setup we calculated to be about 0.7 feet. And then the wave run up, capped wave run up, and this is where it gets a little confusing, but I'll try to make it simple. The wave run up would exceed the road elevation quite a bit. And so you can only exceed the structure so much before you're really just overwashing the structure. You will not continue to have water moving vertically upwards. So the wave run up, if it exceeds a structure, like a crest of a slope, it's often capped at 3 feet above the top of that structure. And FEMA and other, experts in this will say that elevation is your flood elevation. But also what that means is that water is moving over that structure. And so that's what we're seeing happen here. The capped wave run up elevation is 13.5 feet, about 3 feet above that road height. What that means is if you were to elevate that road, the wave run up is going to be higher because now it has more of a surface to run up. And so that's, as you look at designs for elevation, it's something that you kind of calculate iteratively. It doesn't mean that you can elevate above 13.5 feet and be free of flooding. So it's something that you have to do as you do design.
No question.
Yeah.
It's very sensitive to direction.
Yes, the wave action is definitely, the wind direction. And I'm
Very
sure
sensitive.
that you saw this in the storms in January because we were getting that southern wind.
Is that because, just because of the fetch, the distance of fetch?
Yeah, so if you have a southern wind here, then you will get bigger wave heights because it has that distance to grow the wave. Where if you have wind from the north, you will have smaller waves here.
And the assumption is that the water is doing damage. If you add logs and debris, do your models calculate the kind of damage that could be result from more than just water?
So we don't calculate damage. Wave action is what causes damage, and we have evidence of damage at this area. When we do design, so say, for example, you were to elevate this road and put in riprap stone. You design the size of the stone based on the height of the wave that it would be exposed to, in order to prevent erosion of that stone material. So that's where that comes into play. Yeah, Irene.
Leland, for people who may not have been all that absorbed in this, at least until last winter, can you talk a little bit about the 100-year storm designation?
Yes, great question. So a 100-year storm is really a colloquial term. Officially, it's called the 1% annual chance storm, and that is a storm that has a 1% chance of happening in any given year. This is what FEMA flood maps are based off of, although FEMA's flood maps are going to look different than the inundation boundaries that you'll see in this work product. Because they do things a little bit differently, they don't include sea level rise. But a lot of the times we do design for the 100-year storm. You could design something for a 500-year storm or for a 10-year storm, and there are decisions that go along with that. But typically it is standard practice to design for a 100-year storm in terms of the size of the riprap to reduce damage potential and reduce flood potential.
How many 100-year storms have there been in the last 25 years?
So that's a great question. I mean, the water elevations in January were higher than the 100-year still water level. So that's without wave action. So some of them, it was a combination. It wasn't fully from wind-driven waves. It was an astronomical high tide. There has this past January, the water level, the average water level fluctuates all the time. So it is not the same on any given day or any given month. And this past January, the water level was the highest it has been, or the second highest it has been since it started being recorded. This is at the Portland tide gauge, just the average water level. So we're seeing just higher water levels plus an astronomical high tide, and then a coastal storm event came. So the combination, and that's why, we look at this, we like looking at a range of sea levels, because any given water elevation, you can get there from a variety of reasons. It could be sea level rise and a small storm, or it could be a big storm today and no sea level rise.
One thing, I may be behind times here, but are you here by process of a grant that has been specifically given to Surry? And who applied for the grant?
Yes, I will answer that, but anybody stop and jump in. But yes, the town of Surry applied for a grant through the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future called a Community Resilience Partnership, and they were awarded $50,000. Blue Hill and Brooksville, separately from the town of Surry, applied for a grant as two towns together for very similar goals. It's a very simple climate vulnerability assessment, and they were awarded $75,000. And then the three towns decided that they should just join together and pool their resources. And that's what they did. And then they went through a selection process to hire a consultant, and then the GEI is the consultant that the three towns hired.
Will our local taxes be going up because of being given this grant? I mean, a grant actually comes out of the taxpayer's pocket. And that's something the working class people in Surrey are concerned about. Where is this money going to be coming from eventually? Are our taxes going to keep going up? Because we have been given this grant, I would just like full disclosure on that.
So maybe I need to hand that off to somebody from the town to answer.
The grant, well, Chris, do you want to speak?
Yeah, basically the grant came from state funds. And the purpose of this grant is to save money for the town for future events, which just happened to happen 3 times this year, and which were costly. And we want to be proactive and get ahead of the curve here to save money for the town. So in order to do that, because we have limited resources in Surry, we need to apply for grants to pay for things like fixing road structures so that they can withstand storms, so that homeowners aren't cut off, you know, from emergency services and things like that. So it's really, really important to think long range of how we're gonna save money on the long term. And that's by doing it now, getting ahead of it. And fortunately, Surry was one of the first towns to get the climate resilience partnership, which gives us the opportunity to apply for grants with the partnership without using without a local match, without using local money. And that was the goal of this project. And Leela's already helped us in applying for other grants as this project has been unfolding. So more money has come in to help us to move forward that we would not have had the opportunity to have without the information. You have to have that knowledge base to be able to move forward. And that's what we're doing. We're moving forward. Does that answer your question?
It does, I can appreciate wanting to be prepared for future events. The only thing that I'm concerned about is the status of Surry itself. Like, how long can the people living in Surry sustain the extra taxes that might be involved? I mean, this year we got a 15% increase in taxes. And
So
there are some people that wouldn't be a problem at all. And yet there are a working class of people that it's a big problem. Can
So-
we stay here?
So
Yeah.
you're taking this a little bit beyond where it needs to go. Because in addition to what the select board does to be proactive to prevent, you know, a $500,000 damage from a storm, you know, that could happen this year. We are looking at, you know, community and economic development, you know. We recognize that Surry only 98.3% of the property taxes are funded by residents. We don't have businesses contributing. So we have a lot of, we're looking, the three of us, at the big picture in many ways. And one of them is climate. And if we don't get ahead on climate, Charlotte, we're really gonna sink this
I
town.
understand that.
So please stay focused on the climate portion of this and why we're here today. Certainly be able to talk to any one of us about the big picture, but this is part of the big picture. You can't
It's
exist
multifaceted.
in this present day climate without recognizing that climate change is real and is costly.
Yes.
In terms of ranking storms, where do the January, does the tariff storms come in terms of what has been called the 100-year storm?
That's a great question. So the January events were, the water surface elevation was greater than a 100-year storm, but one nuance, which is, you know, I'm trained as an engineer, I am an engineer, and typically everything is very exact when we're designing things. This is not exact. This is the opposite of exact. We don't know. I could not tell you what the water elevation will be during any given storm. So the two events in January, January 10th and January 13th, a lot of coastal towns throughout Maine saw the most damage on January 10th. The water elevation on January 13th was higher, but the wind direction on January 10th was such that the waves were higher and it was more damaging. So there are different ways we could think about it. Not always will a high water surface elevation lead to damage. You could have a smaller storm that is more damaging because of where the waves are hitting. And that's why when we look at this, we like to look at a variety of water elevations, because that gives us kind of the best picture of the possibilities of what could happen.
See, people forget hurricanes, and if you go back in the 50s, we didn't have the high tides or anything, but the 107-mile-an-hour winds,
Very damaging.
very,
Mhm.
and we've been fortunate, we haven't seen a major hurricane in, what, 30 years or so.
So I'm gonna move on to the next site. Well, I guess I have more here. So for Crossroad, here's a photo of the flooding on January 10th. You can see a canoe looking like it's gonna cross the road there. A lot of seaweed. I don't know who, somebody in this room took this photo, I'm sure. You can see that seaweed there that's on top of the road, and you know, if you really like zoom in on this photo, you could see the water moving across the road. So the flooding here, there is a culvert also that is there. And so it's also subject to flooding from heavy rain, and there was a heavy rain event on that day. So it's kind of this combination of that day was like the trifecta: high water level, heavy winds, heavy rain, astronomical high tide. So the wave analysis suggests, and that's what we see, is that there would be wave run up and overtopping of this road, but for present day conditions. If this roadway is inundated, there is an alternate route. There's nobody that would be isolated because of this inundated roadway. And that's one of the safety features that we like to just talk about when we choose areas to focus on. We always recommend that if there is standing water on a road, do not drive through it. You don't know what is underneath that water. You don't know if that culvert has washed out and there actually isn't a road there. It doesn't take much velocity or much speed of that water to really wash a car out or a person if you're walking. And so that's, you know, just the safety thing I have to say is it will be many years before, if something happens to this road in terms of elevation, before it happens. So you will be living with many years of this road still flooding. And so when you see that, don't drive through it, drive around, and there is a way around. So the second site that I'll talk about is the town wharf. So this area is subject to flooding today due to 100-year storms. So it'll be standing water on that wharf, you know, probably also during just present day astronomical high tides. We don't have that in our study, but we know that that does happen. And then by 2090, if the wharf remains as it is, it would start to see flooding every single day during high tide. No buildings would be isolated during inundation here. It's an area that we would suggest you barricade or avoid during flooding. And we did that same sort of detailed wave analysis here. You know, the longest fetch is more from like an easterly direction at this location. And if the wind was from that direction, you could get waves of about 2.8 feet. Wave set up about 0.4 feet. The wave run up here, the structure would already be underwater, so there isn't anything for it to run up on. So you're really just looking at water level and the height of the waves at this location. So about 3, you know, if you round up 3-foot waves that you could see here. And here's a couple photos of the town wharf not underwater, and then the town wharf underwater in the January 10th storm. So the third goal here was to introduce a pilot project. The pilot project for the town of Surry was Newbury Neck Road at Carrying Place Beach. And this area is at risk of flooding today. It happened several times this year. Standing water flooding, so without even having waves occur that would be underwater during a storm. If nothing happens in terms of adaptation by 2090, that road would see flooding every single day during high tide. There are approximately 180 buildings. This is not homes. This is buildings. It could be like a house and a garage or like a shed, but structures that are south of this location that would have no alternate route around. So they would be isolated during periods of storm events, and likely were isolated this past year during the storms. So doing a wave analysis here, we could get wave heights during 100-year storms of over 5 feet. A wave setup of 0.8 feet, and that capped wave run up again. So that's, it could only run up so much past the road, would be between 11.9 and 14.5 feet. And that is an elevation in terms of NAVD 88. That is different than an elevation you would see on a chart, which is usually in reference to low tide, mean low water. This is a different datum that surveyors will often use now. And so if that road were to be elevated, there would be more surface for that water to run up on. And so you would kind of calculate that iteratively before, like I mentioned before, to reach a design height that would reduce wave action.
So just to be clear, you're only talking here about the impact of that area from sea level rise and storm surge.
Mm-hmm.
So if there were also an intense
Rain.
long duration storm with precipitation, the inundation could or would be worse.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, rainfall could contribute to the flood inundation there. The primary reason for flood inundation there is the coastal storms. But rainfall certainly would add to that. So the pilot project report includes several things, environmental considerations, flood exposure, design alternatives, permitting considerations, a cost estimate, right-of-way process, and next steps. And I will be going through some of those adaptation options here. So there were 3 main options we looked at for this site. The first would be to elevate the road in place so that it is above that area of flooding. The second would be to relocate that road inland, and the third option would be to do nothing. It's a little hard to see, but there's a lot of colors happening. There is a red outline right of where the road is. So that is the outline of a mapped frontal dune system by Maine Geological Survey. So frontal dunes are subject to some of the most strict rules in the state in terms of what could be permitted there for a project. And the rules, well, there has been some developments, but the rules as they have traditionally been read and applied are that roads you cannot build a seawall in a sand dune. And if you were to elevate a road, then you are by default creating a seawall because that road is being elevated. And so there are many towns in Maine that are facing the same predicament of having a road in a sand dune that cannot be elevated. And the DEP and the town of Surry has been working very closely with the DEP about this issue. I'm from the town of Islesboro, and they have the very same issue that they're dealing with. One road that floods, it's in a sand dune, small town, isolated people. So I know that DEP is getting a lot of pressure, and there are some updates to that. So because, however, we had reached out to the DEP for this project, and there is, they had mentioned that you could not elevate a road in this place, it wouldn't pass sand dune rules. And so the alternatives that we looked at for this project were relocating the road inland, and that's what I'll talk about in these slides. So that first option, there are limits with the main sand dune rules, like I mentioned. And then the second option is to relocate the road, and there are two alternatives investigated. So there is a pink line and this hashed black line, and those are the two options we looked at. So alternative one, and I just highlighted it now in like yellow hashing just to add more colors to the mix. Alternative one is to relocate the northern section of the road until it intersects with Carrying Place Lane, and then to use Carrying Place Lane until it gets to the end, and then create a connection that gets to Morse Lane, and then you would get back down to Newberry Neck Road. So it's using roads that exist there. I believe they're gravel roads. As part of this process, you would upgrade them to be asphalt roads to support more traffic, if this were to be the preferred alternative. The second option from this we looked at is an entirely new road inland. So it would follow the same route as the first option, and then northern section, and then it would cross Carrying Place Lane and then continue down to connect again to Newberry Neck Road. Here's just a cross-section view. So this is there's an existing culvert, a little small wetland area, an existing culvert that crosses over to the beach just south of the parking area. This is the area that's lowest in elevation, and so we have this profile view where you can see the road, a proposed road that is inland of the existing road, and how much that would need to be elevated above that low point that's existing there. And there would also be a culvert there installed to allow that connectivity of that wetland area. Yes.
There have been news stories within the last month or two from southern Maine relating to beach recovery or dune recovery, where there have been planting of trees. I don't know what specific what specific species or anything. Is there anything like that possible in this area of Carrying Place vegetation that would help to stabilize things?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. So one of the options that we did consider is, if you do restore the dune, you can do a dune restoration project, and in a dune restoration project, you could actually elevate that dune so that it would essentially be kind of like a seawall to the roadway. You couldn't do, the material has to be similar to the natural material that is present at that beach. So if it's like big cobbles, you could do a big cobble road, but it would be subject to a lot of erosion during storms. Pete Slavinsky from the Maine Geological Survey came to Carrying Place Beach and did a site visit. I forget what month that was in, maybe August, and did note that the dune does exist there. Excuse me, done a lot of talking today. And then there is a sand dune update from the town of Surry. I don't know if one of you want to talk about it.
We thought, talking with the DEP multiple times, and visiting with them actually too, that we would have to apply for a change of the rule that Leila mentioned concerning what you cannot basically do on a sand dune. And to do a rule change application, we're talking probably years. Because it would be to the state of Maine government, please change your rule about sand dunes for us. And the other alternative that Rob Wood from DEP suggested that we look at carefully is, a waiver of filing a petition to waive the requirement. And, if we design this, let's just say we're elevating it and we're, putting a massive culvert in because of the marsh that's on the other side of the Newbury Neck, the Carrying Place Beach. If we follow the stipulations that Rob Wood has talked to us about, then we would be successful in that petition to waive the requirement of not touching a sand dune. And part of that, a good part of that reason is because it's the only access road for 140 residents of the town. Household, sorry, yes, so, that was a bit of good news, and I couldn't share it with Tom or Chris, because they were away and I was away, and I got the email, and I was going, I gotta call somebody, but, so far, so good. We have more communication with Rob Wood from DEP, but he gave us some good news just recently, within days.
I saw your email,
Yes,
Yeah.
okay,
but it doesn't apply to the inland route, right?
right,
No, so this would be if you were, because we had basically been told, and so told the town, you cannot elevate your road
Right.
here. It is subject to sand dune rules, and then the town really, took it many steps further with DEP. And Rob Wood, who's, I think is the head of DEP, had said, I think there could be an exemption here. And, if your design follows these stipulations, and so, our recommendation would be that whoever continues to advance this design, work very closely with DEP throughout all steps of the process, so that you don't spend a lot of money and get the final design, and then DEP says like, we can't permit this. But he did write it in an email.
Yeah.
We have that documentation, and so it seems like a very good sign that you could do a project at the existing road location. So
and we
it's
all,
very good news.
and I'll also add that doing it that way would probably be far less expensive than creating a whole new road inland, and all that entails, so that's another big
Yes.
factor is the cost.
For that alternative, assuming that the waivers were in place, how much elevation over the existing elevation are you talking about?
So it would be something that the town would need to consider, in terms of the flood risk that they would be willing to handle.
Because your table said 14 to 15 feet.
Yeah, so the low point of the road is around 9 feet, so it could be quite a bit of elevation. In some places along that road.
Like,
It could be 6 feet, for example.
Yeah, probably 5 to 6 feet something.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and it's something that, you would really have to work out in the next step of preliminary design of what could that even look like? What kind of revetment would you need to have there? And what would that footprint be, and any sort of like impacts to boundary properties there?
So I'd also like to add too that without the information that your firm has created and worked for us to provide, we'd still be at the planning, even pre-planning stages. This will allow us to go with some confidence to engineering firms and start our pre-construction phase. And without this information, we would be at a real loss. So it's all coming together. It's little baby steps, but nevertheless, I see progress. So.
Yeah, and the town of Surry has been I think received have 2 grants to continue this project onwards.
And that doesn't require any taxpayer money. Grants generally don't. That's why we apply for grants, because we don't have the taxpayer money to use.
Right.
And I just wanted to thank Alan Kratz, our grant consultant, because he's been guiding us on who to contact in
Yeah.
DEP. On one level, he took me to the Maine Climate Council, meet with DEP, and then Mary stepped in, and he's just been guiding us through the bureaucracy for us to actually make a rule change that no other town has done. So, you know, so that's, I was really grateful to.
Been a team effort.
Yeah, it was great teamwork effort.
So I'll keep moving on. This, you know, the third adaptation alternative here is to do nothing. So here's a photo of the road, I think on January 10th being flooded. So that's, you know, definitely a road you cannot drive through. Would be very dangerous to do so. So if you do nothing there would be continued inundation, there would be damage and repair costs and restricted access to the peninsula. So doing nothing would be asking the residents to stay in their homes, to not travel. It would cut off access to emergency services. And there would be, and you know, like I said before, for Cross Road, it will still be many years before something happens here. So between now and then, you will still be living with this risk, and it's still something that you need to think about in terms of when coastal storms are coming, if you want to be on the northern side of that road, or if you want to hunker down at your home.
The other thing I'll also add too, that we learned from Nina, Ellen and I went to a conference in Augusta and spoke directly with our MEMA contact there, and she said, we're all about mitigation of a situation like this. We're not about, you got $300,000 or $400,000 worth of damage to this road in the 2024. The town cannot come up with that kind of money every time there's a bad storm. And NEMA is there to help us figure out how to engineer this so that we're mitigating the problem and we're not gonna be faced with continuous $200,000 or $300,000 or $400,000 worth of damage to that vulnerable spot. So NEMA is on our side, their mitigation, not just fixing it like it always was. They're
Right.
fixing it better.
So to Mary's point, you're developing a plan for the long term, but maybe you need to have a plan for how you're gonna do repairs each year. Well, you're needing to have a major plan done, because, I mean, they were working on that road the entire winter. Yeah.
Have a long time, you need to get it back into.
Yeah,
habitable
so
conditions, yeah.
how do you plan to minimize the cost?
In the next few
Before you get to
years,
your 15-foot road or your bridge or whatever, how do you sort of plan to minimize the costs and the effects in the meantime?
I think there are a few things that are being done. Number one, Stan has increased the height of the riprap behind the beach.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's higher than it was. Secondly, in front of your house, he's looking to put in erosion control there. And we're also talking to Andrew McCullough about the pines
It's the engineer.
to study what needs to be done there, because that's a little bit different. There's a ledge there. And so it's not just a question of putting down rock, it has to be stabilized. So those are three additional things that are contemplated in the near term. What we're talking about here is a long-term solution, but you know, I think what Stan is doing is would be better, but it's not going to be an answer.
I mean, just keeping track of the cost over time. I don't think people realize how much you're spending, and also, you know, absorbing all of Stan's time in that small piece of road for so many months and not being a resource to the rest of the town.
Well, also,
Yeah.
thank you for bringing that up,
Yeah.
that's always, I mean,
Yeah.
that is a concern, because how many more years of this kind of damage can be sustained until we can fix it? But Tom has worked really hard this past number of months, for months, in fact, working with FEMA for the reimbursement of those expenses that we incurred, with the massive repairs that had to be done, so we're getting most of that money back from FEMA, it looks like, so,
Plus some mitigation
yes,
money,
right.
but not the type of mitigation we're talking about here.
Right. So we're working on all fronts to kind of work on this issue of vulnerability, and right now we're focused. Leila's pointing our attention to this very vulnerable place on the Green Neck Road at Carrying Place Beach. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, I encourage it. Okay, so this same that I mentioned before, some of the things the pilot project report includes are some of the permitting considerations, cost estimates for various alternatives and next steps. And next steps I have here. So that would be for this project to decide on whether, when, and which adaptation alternatives to pursue relevant funding options. So there are funds in place. There will be another round of funding that will be required to construct the road. And to contract with consultants to continue on with this design process and do field investigations, like getting a survey team out there to look at property boundaries and get elevations of the site to delineate where the wetland impacts are, to understand what permits would be needed, and to do some more community engagement throughout this process for the alternatives that are advanced through design. And so the last goal of this project, so that's all I had for the Newbury Neck Road. So if anyone has something else to say, we can talk about it, and I'll have questions at the end too. But the last goal is community engagement. So I'm going to talk about what we're leaving you with. So there are two things we're leaving you with. The first is the ArcGIS story map. I put a QR code up. I'll have it on more slides, and we'll also distribute a link, but this is an interactive website where you can zoom in to pan around, zoom in all around Surry, or if you want to look up Blue Hill and Brooksville, you can too, it's all there. And turn on the different flood layers to see where the flooding would occur for different time frames and which areas would likely experience flooding. And then the second one is the community science. So I'll talk a little bit more about both of these. So here are some screenshots of that story map that you can look at. So here is an example for Surry. So you can look at flood inundation so this example is a 3 feet of sea level rise and a 100-year storm. So what would that flooding look like? And you can, like I mentioned, pan around and look at your own house and if it is flooded or not. And we also have some more details on those 3 sites, so Crossroad, Town Wharf, and Newbury Neck Road at Carrying Place Beach. So we've highlighted those, and you'll find some more information as you scroll through the site on those 3 sites. And then ongoing community science. So this was an initiative that the Gulf of Maine Research Institute led. So there are 3 sites in Surry where signage will be put up that explains how to contribute data. So that is at Crossroad, Newbury Carrying Place Beach, but Newbury Neck Road at Carrying Place Beach, and the Surry Town Wharf. And so at each of these sites, if there is a flooding event that will likely occur, so king tide or coastal storm surge is coming, you can head to those sites, take a photo, document the flooding that you observe, and there will be a sign there for instructions about how to upload that to the community science website. So here's an example of an observation. This is on January 10th. So you upload the photo, you can see the point in the tide cycle when that observation was made and some observations. So minor flooding here, it was heavily raining at the same time. And this is very useful. You can go to this website, which will be on the signs, or you can look up the Gulf of Maine Research Institute Community Science, and you can see observations that have already been made across Maine, but in Surry or in the other towns on the Blue Hill Peninsula, and some photos of flooding that have occurred. And so here's my final slide, and this is really next steps for climate adaptation for the town of Surry. This recommendation I had for all 3 towns is to create and maintain a digital database of assets. So this could be any infrastructure in the town, culverts, if there are septic tanks or wells. I mean, we have some of this, but not all real town-owned infrastructure. And that is really your foundation and your starting point for any type of study or just an understanding of what you have out there what size it is, where it's located, what the elevation is. It's just a good practice to start compiling them. The second recommendation we have is to refine the flood risk for the design. So if those roads are elevated, to continue looking at how that would impact the waves that you would see there, and to size culverts using the coast-wise approach. So this is really, I'm talking here in reference to Cross Road. So that's a pretty big culvert now, and if you were to elevate that road, you want to look at that tidal impact of that culvert so that it's sized appropriately, so that it reduces the risk of flooding from both directions, both from the tide and from the rainwater, and just helps promote that habitat restoration of that tidal connection that is there. So the coast-wise approach, the document that was created, collaboration with many agencies in Maine and Maine DOT to really step you through the process of how you do those designs. And then continued regional collaboration. So that's continuing to work with the neighboring towns in order to advance climate goals. It really helps to pool resources in terms of funding, but also personnel to manage these projects. Alan was able to manage all 3 towns, so that was excellent. It also was great to have a committee that had many people on it that had different views and expertise that benefited all of the towns. And so that was very helpful as well. And then increased social resiliency. And so this is really, before we are able to actually elevate a road or do an infrastructure project, we can reduce our risk to flooding by taking measures like barricading roads or alerting your neighbors, or as a town, posting on the town website of when, if, there's a storm coming, we will likely barricade this road. Please leave this area if you need access to medical services. And so just starting to change your thinking around when you could be isolated. And then the last one I have is to continue engaging with planners and/or consultants to secure grant funds. Some of these, like I mentioned before, the cost of constructing these projects is quite high. And grants that cover those federal grants that are millions of dollars have very extensive application processes. And there are consultants out there and planners who have experience going through those lengthy applications and administering those grants. And so just another recommendation to continue working with professionals. And that's what I'm gonna say.
So next week, you're gonna present the pilot study in greater depth, right?
Yes, so that's next Monday, right? Yeah.
Next Monday, so we got just a small briefing
Yep.
on what that entails, but you're gonna go into in more detail.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's also posted on our website.
Yeah.
It's gonna happen at the Surry Elementary School.
And it's at 6 p.m., I believe.
Monday.
6 p.m., yeah.
Is that gonna have a Zoom access?
We hope so. That's our goal. It may not be participatory for the Zoom attendees, but I
They
think
could
I worked
listen
out.
at least, yeah.
Yeah. We'll probably consult with our Marcus, who's the IT coordinator for the Surrey School.
Yeah, we plan that because we want to also record it, right?
Yes,
Oh, plus you're gonna be on Zoom.
Yes, because I also
Yeah.
yeah,
will not
So
be
it
here
has to
for
be on
this.
yes, it would be.
Yeah.
Whether people can participate is, I'm not sure yet, but yes, you'll be on
Did you
Zoom.
put that one back up with the options for the New Brae Neck Road and carrying place? Right there. If we had to put a new road in, how far up carrying place lane would that?
Directly.
Any idea what how far up that would be?
So this is, something that is mentioned in the report, and, we'll mention more. This is these lines as they are drawn are not set in stone. This is really just an idea. It would really take the next step of, getting those parcel boundaries delineated to get an understanding and the local topography of that area to really know like where it would be most feasible to put a road.
You know, that would be right in the middle of some lots on our road.
Yeah,
And would that, in the connecting part for either option there, you mentioned culvert, is it culvert or is it bridge? Is it there? 'Cause
it would be a sorry, a culvert there.
would be.
Good one.
Yeah, yeah.
If that were the choice, would there be an historic preservation type of research done there before anything was carried out? Because that is the carrying place and that
Right.
is where the Abenaki tribe carried their canoes from Morgan's Bay to Union River Bay, so.
Yeah, and I think that is all part of the permitting process. That is one of the permits that, part of the whole investigation of impacts to that.
Moving that way, huge issue is gonna be wetlands.
Right,
Mhm. Yeah,
it's all wet.
yep. Yeah, wetland impacts there. Yeah, and wet,
yellow line, that's the wetland.
And is that largely on the property that the town owns, or does that go into the adjoining property?
He would go across it.
Is what, Moira?
That little connecting piece from the original road, is that largely on the town's
Part of it is,
lot?
but-
Is some of it on Bunny's lot?
yes, some of it very much on privately owned.
It's on town-owned land up to where the, connects with the, goes across carrying place.
Yeah.
yeah.
Well,
So an obvious thing about this option would be access to these properties. And so either through land purchase agreements or some other method, and that's something that the report kind of details of how that would happen. And even elevating the road where it is now, the footprint would widen and extend on the private property there as well.
Yeah, that, if you go 5 or 6 feet, that's gonna be a huge footprint
Yes.
with the riprap mitigation and everything.
I hope you'll take me seriously. I'm not making a joke here. But are you running into groups of people confronted with this situation where it's incredibly expensive and the organization of it is just humongous? Are you running into people that are of a mind that they will be done? And possibly working on something like this on a conscious level, prayer. I mean, this is huge.
The amount of money in order
I'm not negating any of the factors here, and I certainly am sympathetic with people who've already suffered damage. But this is something the human race has brought upon itself. And maybe there's a higher lesson to learn here rather than bricks and stones and whatever.
Mhm.
I just like to point that out. That's where I find myself. That you can run into so many bulwarks that are no, no, no. And there's a higher lesson to be learned,
Mhm.
and maybe we can get to that. Just a suggestion.
Yep, thank you for sharing.
Lila, or anybody, are the pines, is that actually on that map or is that south there?
I think it is on this.
Yeah.
The
Map.
roads both come out just after the pines.
I don't know if you can see
Should
my
be right
map.
about there, right?
Where?
Right about there.
Yeah,
Okay.
And if you made an access to a new road, would you just leave the original road as is and let it erode away, or would you open up that culvert, or what would you do?
that's a really good question. There are options you could do, currently. As it is, the majority of the time you can drive down that road. And so, one thing you could think about is creating kind of like a emergency access road and not a full-blown road, and kind of move there over the years. Another thing is. Because there would be a lot of environmental permitting and you're going through a wetland there. You can kind of negotiate with DEP, but if you are impacting a wetland, but you're restoring environment elsewhere, it balances itself out. And so that's kind of an option there if you were to restore the wetland or the dune where the road is. That can, buy you points with DEP. Yes.
In terms of the type of construction, if the a road were elevated in place, what immediately comes to mind is a solid base of gravel and rock that would be a water barrier, but would there be an option of an elevated road on some sort of open structure where water, if there were high water, it could pass underneath.
Yeah, so no matter, really, that is a bridge in theory. So even if we didn't do a bridge here, you would still need to have, where the wetland area is, we would suggest putting in a large culvert there because there is that wetland and that, again, buys you the environmental points and allows to reconnect that tidal access that currently is pretty restricted by the small culvert that is there. If you were to elevate this to create a bridge, it becomes a very long bridge and it becomes complicated. So DOT takes ownership of a bridge that's longer than, I don't know if it's like 26 feet or there's some distance where if a town wants to build a bridge, DOT says, okay, now we're actually going to manage this and oversee the design of this because it's a pretty significant structure. DOT doesn't like doing that. So I don't know all of the politics of that, but I know it is, discouraged to really turn into a bridge.
1,500 feet. That's a big.
It is about 1,500 feet, yes. Yeah.
Could you put a little ferry, like a little cable ferry?
Yeah,
Stand
We
by
have them
there.
all over Nova Scotia, right?
it is true,
They're pretty efficient.
just goes, that's true, I've been on those ferries, you just hop on and go across.
In that area where it goes into the wetlands, if you had a large culvert,
Mhm.
16, 18 feet wide, would that mitigate the level?
It wouldn't mitigate the level of flooding from the ocean, because that ocean, the height of that ocean is going to go where it goes, regardless of if there is a culvert there. But it would help the flooding from rainfall, because it wouldn't be ponded behind the roadway. It would have, an avenue underneath.
To relieve itself.
Yeah.
Well, it seems like that culvert's so small that the sand that's washed up there hasn't been able to come back out.
Mhm.
So that creates a flooding risk to others.
Yeah.
Stan watches those pretty close, so. He's always there after a storm to
Yeah,
clear those out.
yes, he is.
I'm intrigued by what you said a moment ago, that it sounded like you were suggesting there might be a fourth alternative, which is an emergency alternative road that doesn't have to be a macadamide, an asphalt road. That would in essence be easements and still use the existing road.
It is an option. I mean, you would still have to go through the process of some level of design to actually put in a gravel road, clearing trees that are there. And the rights, acquiring rights to the properties.
Ownership or easement or
Yeah.
So the problem, George, is that, if you retain the current road, you had an emergency road. You still have to pay for damage that occurs when you have these storms. And the January storm, for that section probably cost us in the neighborhood of 300,000. So that's a big hit. So there's a real cost benefit analysis that needs to be done
Right.
to determine whether that's a viable financial option.
But to build a full-fledged alternative road is gonna cost a lot of $300,000.
Well,
What?
No, so it costs
Just
benefit
what?
analysis.
well,
Yeah.
I think the estimates in the report are like 2 to 4 million.
Yeah, 2 to 4.
Mhm.
For the alternative road or for raising the
No,
existing road?
The alternative
road.
So,
But you could go through 10 repair
yeah, that
stores.
sounds, 2 million sounds low, but, but even 4 million, I mean, that's, you know, if it's 300,000 a year,
Yeah, and the sources of money are different, so.
you know,
Yeah.
you discount the 4 million, you know,
The town should buy a Powerball ticket.
So the fifth alternative is make it an island resort.
Right.
It's $3.
That's the
well,
one.
fine for you to say you're on the other side of the.
Many years ago, before all these regulations we have now, you could go in there and drive these interlocking pilings down, you know, build a new wall there and you could build it as high as you wanted to keep the water out. But you can't use those anymore. That's the all stone
Mhm.
and all that, no.
Have any studies been made, like how Swans Island dealt with that storm? What are they doing? I'm wondering if you could connect two bays, make an island.
Mhm.
Could relieve some of the tension on the specific spots.
Yeah, I'm not sure what Swans Island has done there. I would have to look into that.
Can we, I don't wanna keep Bailey here till
We're gonna talk about.
10 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
How about 2 more questions and then we'll wrap up and I'll invite you to come next Monday night over to the Surrey School for the more in-depth presentation. 2 more questions. Myron?
You know, the area marked with the red line, that's the alleged dune.
Mhm.
And.
It's a dune.
Well, because none of us have ever driven past it, so look at that lovely dune. So we have, you know, one small culvert right now, which goes across Carrying Place there. If you put a number of culverts, not to where you get to, it's a bridge, right?
Mhm.
But if you put a number of culverts in there and you did grading behind, is there any way to perhaps funnel the water that would go through the different culverts to go over to Morgan Bay through Carrying Place?
There's a second one before more.
From rainfall events, you mean?
No, I'm talking about
Yeah, we could use Morris
Would that not do
driveway,
much? Pardon me?
we use Morris driveway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Joining all these front lawn.
So it's just that for flooding from the ocean, the water is just going to be the height of the water, no
You
matter,
don't get anywhere with that.
no matter where, yeah.
Can't have engineer.
Almost an impossible. It's impossible.
But at the end of the day, time is money. And look what costs are escalating.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah.
Look what happened to the power line. They waited, 3 years to hold it up and double the cost.
Yeah.
That's what we're looking at.
Right, yeah, it's really kind of the time is now.
Especially if we can get on the front end of it.
Well, thank you for all of your time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'd like to mention one other person. I gave a
Yes.
thank you at the
Yeah.
beginning to Chris, who was on the advisory committee, Chris Stark and Irene Schmidt were on the advisory committee. Also Dennis Riley, who came in a little bit late, was on the committee. Leila mentioned the diversity of talent on that committee, and I think you can see it among the 3 of Surrey's representatives, and it was echoed by the other 2 towns as well. So thank you for what you all do. coming tonight, supporting this effort and giving your ideas.
Yes, and I'll invite you again, reminding you Monday night, Leland will be back on Zoom to give a more in-depth presentation focusing on specifics. So please attend at the Surry School, 6 o'clock Monday evening.
So everybody on Zoom, are you comfortable with what you heard, or do you have any questions?
All going home, they're going to bed.
No, it all sounds reasonable.
Thank you for joining.
Thank you, Bill.
Well, thank you again.
Well, you still have one?